This is the 65th episode of the Effective Executive podcast and YouTube channel. And this past week, I spent some time and I watched a movie about the great financial crisis that we had. Now, I'd worked with banks pretty much from 2000, well, even beyond, but pretty heavily from 2000 up until 2000 and I'm going to say eight. And, you know, I had a front row seat to some of the activities that were going on. But there have been a number of movies that have been produced about the great financial crisis. And it got me to thinking about, you know, what lessons should any executive learn from what went on there. And some I'm going to draw from my experience, some from the movie. A lot of you have watched movies like The Big Short. It's probably the most known movie by people. And if you haven't seen it, it's a great movie. You got to watch The Big Short. Another one is called Inside Job. Pretty well watched. Too Big to Fail is another one. But the one that I watched this past week was the Flaw, and one of the things that came up was while this financial crisis was going on, and all these bad loans were going out, what happened with the executives? Why didn't they know about what was going on? Were they just oblivious to it? Did they turn their heads because they were making lots of money, getting big bonuses, those types of things? What was the situation that's going on? Now, I'll give you my thoughts about it because, like I said, I was working with a number of very large banks and a regional bank and some of the executives from there. But at a regional bank that I was at, they wanted to kind of break out of this kind of dull banking world after the financial crisis. I'm sure they would have loved to have gone back to a dull banking world, but they bought a mortgage company that was just making lots of money and signing up all these mortgages and those types of things. And to be a boring bank just didn't seem very exciting anymore. And a lot of the executives that I talked to from this company, from this bank, really bought into the mortgage company is out there making all these sales, those types of things. And I could tell you that, one of the things that I ran into was an executive came up to me and said, basically, some of the things that you're preaching about the system and those types of things, but this mortgage bank is making lots of money, and this going back to something where you have the system is the most important thing. The biggest problem you have with banks is not a teller giving out too much money or embezzlement, those types of things, but it's bad loans, and that's been known for decades. And I didn't really know much about this mortgage company other than they were killing it. And sure enough, this bank got caught up in the great mortgage crisis with the bundled loans and everything else. It almost put them out of business. And this happened obviously all after I had to quit working with them. But it was quite an eye-opener in that, at least for this bank, it wasn't about necessarily totally about greed. They just saw that there was this mortgage company that they wanted to buy, and they were just, they were killing it in sales, and they really wanted to kind of change their culture to really going out there and growing things. And there's nothing wrong with that. It's just, how do you go about doing it? There were a number of other banks that I worked with during the time period, and I would say they're maybe a little bit more nefarious, maybe turning their heads just because things were going so well. They're making big bonuses, at the bank. But this is a problem. Being oblivious as an executive to these types of things, I believe is now really unacceptable, not only on the public domain, but also just from a competency standpoint. So there's this great need now for not just banking executives, but any executive to really know what's going on between the customer and their organization. And if they don't know what's going on, there may be some things, and I have seen other companies other than just banks go through scenarios where if I'm making a lot of money doing that, even though that's kind of a questionable thing. But the first thing, obviously the first thing is you've got to know what's going on. Whether you're turning your head away from it or not is something totally different. And I've fired clients in the past that did turn their heads to really almost felonious, and certainly conducting a misdemeanor on their customers. And I think that's really kind of a poor way to run a business, especially for longevity. Ultimately, it almost always gets found out. And there's no reason to build your business that it kills it. Once somebody finds out about, you're turning your head or acting like you don't know something's going on, but you do, that's a huge problem. But a lot of executives that I work with, especially in large companies, they don't even look. They're too caught up in their meetings and their financial statements and those types of things. And it's one of the first hurdles have to overcome with any executive and coaching them is getting them to go look at what's going on between their customers and their organization and being real about what's happening there. And I believe that this is super important because it's a competitive advantage for you. Most executives won't go to the work. They've gotten, especially in large organizations, because they'll say it's time or whatever. Sometimes it's just ego. But to be able to sit and listen to what customers are saying, not with meetings with them per se, but going to their contact center, especially large organizations are going to have contact centers. And those interactions that are happening between the customer and your organization reveal so much about how you're performing. You can find huge amounts of opportunity just by taking that. Really, it's a small step, and it's also going to make you more knowledgeable about what's going on in your organization. And as far as being someone that wants to keep rising through the ranks in their organization, the more you know about the customer, that's real, not just a bunch of data on a sheet, but from listening to conversations and knowing information that supports the data or maybe even contradicts the data that you're getting is hugely important to your career. So anyway, that's what I wanted to communicate this week, the importance of spending time and really know what's going on in the organization. And, are you conducting yourself in such a way morally for the good of society that it's not just the profit. The profit will come if you're serving customers really well. That's just a natural flow of things. But are you working on, are you interacting at that frontline level? And that's the message I wanted to communicate this week. Catch you next week.